Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We work with hedge funds, private equity, family offices, registered investment advisors, and individuals like you to help you get better returns in the stock market. I'm here today with Dr. David Glancy of the IWP, the Institute for World Politics. He works with Dr. John Lanchowski, who was President Reagan's national security advisor on the then Soviet Union and is a member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. Dr. Glancy has expertise in geopolitics and economics, and in my opinion, has a more clear view of the intersection of those two topics than just about anybody in academics. Dr. Glancy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Gary.
All right, so why don't we get started? The key point that you sent me in our pre-interview discussions is about the trend toward more conflict and more uncertainty in international relations. I agree with you. We are hitting a time of greater uncertainty we've had since the Cold War. I'd love to just get your view on that to start.
No, thank you. Absolutely. This is sort of, we're kind of seeing the culmination or kind of the endpoint of a lot of trends that are coming together over the last 20 years. We have more players that have bigger impact, middle powers that have more reach, more resources, more ability to impact international affairs. So that complicates things. You have the diffusion of technology. So technology is enabling non-state actors and smaller actors to have a larger role and to affect conflict and even combat, which we're seeing, everywhere from Ukraine to the Middle East. And then also you see revisionist powers like Russia, Iran, China, they're being more assertive and being more aggressive and sort of throwing their weight around. You've also seen over the last 20 years or so, the US trying to pull back from the world in a lot of ways. And so that has actually opened up where, in the past, you would have had an expected sort of US response. Now the US response is in question sometimes, and we don't have as much weight as we had when we were sort of the sole hyperpower, which we enjoyed for a number of years. So because of that, I think there's more conflict. And, if you read the headlines today, or, just about any time in the last year or so, you might not want to get out of bed. You might not want to leave your house. But this is going to continue for the foreseeable future, I think. And you could just kind of ignore it. But I think the better way forward is to try to understand it and understand what these trends mean, what these conflicts, the trajectory is going to be, and then how to invest more knowledgeably if you're an investor or you're investment professional, because I think we're going to have to live with this world as it is for quite a while.
So one of the things I'd love to get into is I think if we go back through American history, there's always been discussion, debate. The US has never had, one clear voice. We've always had lots of, since the founding of this country, right? We've had conflict, discussion, debate. But it's my perception that through most of the last century, we at least had a coherent foreign policy. That people might discuss and debate the right course of action, but in general, the government took a particular course of action, and allies could depend on the United States to handle similar situations in similar ways. In my opinion, I see that breaking down now. And what we have are really factions with very, very different points of view. And we can have literally every 2 to 4 years a change in foreign policy. So how, if the United States chooses to stay engaged instead of pulling back, as I believe that's your preference, but how do we stay engaged and have relationships with allies, or even come to agreement with countries who are not our allies, when any agreement we make is subject to revision, when the change of a presidential administration and, 4 or fewer years?
That's a good question. I think some of it is dealing with some of the hot button issues here and some of the impact. So, doing things like, taking care of the border in the south would take something off the plate that I think would then allow for more discussion, for more agreement on some of these other broader issues and the broader engagement. Being able to address some of the truly unfair trade practices of countries like China. I think that's important to, and some of their other malign actions. I think that will help, and we can come together on some of those issues. So I think it's going to take, and there's always been, as you mentioned, a lot of tension and sort of isolationist tendencies in the U.S. It makes it more difficult for allies. I think you're going to see allies taking sort of a little bit more on their own. You have the Europeans, which we'll see if they actually follow through with it, but they're stepping up a little bit more for their own defense industry and defense spending. So it's going to be, this is what makes it more challenging for both international actors, diplomats, but also international businesses to try to understand the way forward. So I think that is a complicating factor. There's no easy answer. Hopefully we'll be able to come together a little bit more after this next election. It remains to be seen. We'll see what happens. But I think a lot of allies are holding on to see what happens, through this year. So.
Yeah, and I think the problem goes beyond just our relationships with our allies, although that is significant. I think it's difficult to come to any sort of agreement with, let's just call them our enemies, when they don't know, that, listen, one of the reasons they're our enemies is because we consider them to be unreliable. But from their point of view, we may be unreliable. We've had different views on, again, in U.S. involvement, whether we should pull back, how involved our military should be, who we should support. And so I think there's some, right or wrong, I think there's some sense among our enemies that the United States right now is not a partner where they feel like they can have an agreement. Now, again, I'm not saying their point of view is the right one, but if the other side thinks you're not agreement capable or will live up to your agreements, then you're not going to get an agreement, even if you're acting in good faith. So I'm not endorsing their point of view. I'm just saying we have to deal with their point of view.
No, I think we do have to deal with their point of view. I would push back a little bit and say, though, that their point of view and ours on a lot of issues is going to be, it's going to be really hard to reconcile. We may be able to coexist, but and avoid sort of a hot conflict with China, but their claims on the South China Sea, their actions towards some of our allies like the Philippines, there's just not a lot of common ground. Sort of a neutral sort of, again, avoiding a hot conflict might be possible, but with Russia and their claims with Ukraine, with Iran and its practice with proxies and trying to exert its influence throughout the Middle East, those are against our national interests. And it's going to be, there may be some accommodation, but I don't think we can actually get to a negotiated settlement for a lot of these issues, because the world that our adversaries, a lot of them want, is different from the world that we would like. And so that those differing worldviews, I think, is kind of at the heart of the conflict. And that's going to be hard to reconcile. And it's you have, and I don't begrudge any country from acting in its national interests. I think the U.S. needs to do more to be strategic and act in our national interests to counter some of the ways that these adversaries are acting. But it's, the Russians are going to try to push their advantage. They're going to be active in Africa, supporting coups. And, a lot of that, there's often an economic component to their political components to a lot of these conflicts. And You see in Africa that it's sort of helping fund, and there's a monetary issue for the groups helping with the coups and for destabilizing parts of Africa. But there's also the issue of uranium and minerals. And a lot of the countries where the Russians are active have uranium deposits. And that helps them consolidate their control over uranium mining and the whole sort of distribution, which even the US still relies on Russian or former Soviet states for our nuclear capabilities. And I think that that's one of the challenges. There's a professor, I don't know, I read it secondhand, but a professor from Harvard who made a comment about green energy really being red energy. And I think, being able to understand the supply chains and the supply chains for especially kind of the transition economy, the green technology, a lot of that resides in China, but then also for the nuclear component, it resides in Russia. So we really need to be smart, I think, when we're thinking about this transition to renewables, because right now we don't, we're reliant on places like China for a lot of the inputs for that, for the solar and even wind farms and such. So
Yeah, there's no question that I mean, I like that expression, green energy is really red energy. There's no question that if you want to have windmills or solar, you're going to be using a lot of Chinese product. And I think something that a lot of people are missing is Chinese mining, Chinese manufacturing does not adhere to the same environmental regulations that the United States does. And so, a lot of people who are in favor of this kind of energy are doing so because they think it's good for the environment. In fact, what we're really doing is just transferring some of the pollution from the United States to China, but it's worldwide pollution, right? You can't keep pollution local. On the nuclear
just
side, didn't
please
we
go ahead.
sell a number of years back a large amount of U.S. uranium reserves to the Russians?
I believe so. I don't know. I don't follow that
Yeah,
closely.
I believe Secretary Clinton was in charge of that.
We haven't been strategic in our energy outlook. I mean, we have resources. We have oil and gas. We've done more to gain some energy independence, but now we're sort of going back to energy dependence on others through the green energy reliance on places like China. And this is going to be, I think there's a movement and there's opportunities for the mining sector. The government's actually getting involved. I mean, I'm very much for the free market and government being minimally involved, but I think for some issues like national security, the government needs to play a role because private sector isn't or hasn't focused on these. They're more focused on the bottom line instead of some of these other sort of securing production capabilities, which might cost more, but ensures that we have access to rare earth metals and some of the other components that metals and minerals that are important for green technology. So I think we're going to get there, and everything from chips to mining and minerals, but it's going to be a 10-15 year transition probably if we really focus on it. And that, again, offers opportunities for, potentially investment in those areas because you're going to see competition between China and the US in these areas. The US, the Europeans have woken up, thankfully, to a good extent about sort of the domination China has in these important areas. And so they're pouring in resources, they're putting in policies. Some of it's state-backed or state-owned even. But I think it's going to be a bumpy ride, and there's going to be probably increased costs over the next 10 years, just as in general, globalization is a little more fragmented. Um, but I think we can get there, but it's, again, there's going to be opportunities, but there's also going to be challenges because China is going to be, trying to continue to have its monopoly in some of these areas.
Yeah, I think those are good points. And like you, in general, I'm in favor of private enterprise. I prefer that the government not be in charge of large segments of the economy or important segments of the economy. With that said, two things that have been outsourced to Asia or, China in particular, um, over the last few decades are pharmaceutical manufacturing and most of the chip manufacturing, which at the high end really takes place in Taiwan. Um, those industries need to be onshored.
Yeah, the onshoring, friendshoring, I kind of like the term friendshoring as well. If we onshore everything, then there are some risks as well. If we have certain problems here. So if we can have reliable supply chains, with partners, with friendly democratic partners, I think that's a good idea, and that we don't have to bring everything back to the U.S., but bringing it to the U.S., bringing it to allied countries. I think those two areas, especially, as you note, are going to be very important for the U.S. And that it's interesting. You're seeing again. I'm not a financial advisor. This is kind of research for and folks who do the investing. But I think we can talk about some of the segments and areas where these trends are driving investment, driving potential opportunities. And I see manufacturing in the U.S. across the board as being very positive. Between chips, pharmaceuticals, you have even Germany is investing a lot in the U.S. There's just a story, I think, in the Financial Times this week about that. So U.S. investment in the U.S. in different technologies, I think could be an investment opportunity, and leave it to folks, investment professionals to see how to take advantage of that. But I think that's something that's going to continue. Investment in China is going down. Money's going to other countries in Asia. That's going to be opportunities, everywhere from India to Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. It's going to take a while for them to develop the hubs to really have a major impact. But again, over the next 5-10 years, I think you're going to see supply chains evening out, some of the costs again going down after a period of costs going up, because I would argue you're not seeing decoupling from China. Really, it's more sort of diversifying. So instead of putting new factories in, companies are diversifying instead of investing too much more into China. But we really aren't decoupling yet, except maybe in some high tech areas. And so, I think there are investment opportunities, in these other sort of neighboring countries in Asia, but also, in the U.S. and even U.S., Mexico, Canada. You're going to see increased investment, foreign investment, in those places as well.
David, that's going to be a great segue to getting to the supply chain versus regional geography issues you and I have discussed. Before we move on, I just want to ask you about one other big picture issue, because there's something in the notes that you sent me that I want to read. I think it's really interesting, and I'd love to get you to characterize it, provide a little more detail. So for the people listening to this, David sent me notes about current conflicts, areas of tension, and that these reflect multi-decade trends. And in the notes, what you're saying is that revisionist powers are being more aggressive, middle powers are increasing their influence in the international arena, and that technology is empowering non-state and small state actors and changing aspects of warfare. So first, what do you mean by revisionist powers, and more aggressive in what way? And then let's also talk about the middle powers and the way the small state actors are using technology. And then we can move on to some of the specifics. But I think this is a really interesting general point you're making, and I'd love to get more detail on it.
Sure, appreciate that. So revisionist powers, those countries that want to change the current and kind of the post-World War II international order. So the order that the US led after World War II, kind of a European US led system with the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, free trade organizations, regional security, NATO, US alliances and partnerships in the Middle East, and then also our sort of posture, military force posture and alliances in Asia. So I see Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the major powers, smaller ones, Cuba, Venezuela, being the revisionist states that want to change the status quo. And those are really kind of adversarial states, and those that, it's a bit of a zero-sum game between our interests and theirs, that they want to, in the case of Russia, it wants to expand its territory. In China, it's trying to change some of the ways states think about trade and go about trade with its development of state-owned enterprises and trying to dominate markets. You see China building up its military and building up small islands in the East Asia, trying to push out the US so that they can have more sort of a say and can push around the smaller countries in Asia. So I think that's what I mean by the revisionist powers. You have middle powers that are having more money, more influence, more of a role. Here you see, and these are states that sometimes will align with their interests, and sometimes they'll have interests that will not align with the US. Saudi Arabia, I think, is a good example. We used to have a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia. Back even in the Cold War, we were able to get them to produce more oil, which put pressure on the Soviet Union because it lowered oil prices. When President Biden asked the Saudis to do this more recently, they were more independent. They have their own youth bulge and development issues that they want to do, and so they didn't want to lower the price of oil, which would have put more pressure on Russia with its war in Ukraine. So they're asserting more of an independent foreign policy. They're having some talks and some working with the Chinese a little bit in the Middle East as well. So you have countries like that that are able to navigate their own way, kind of play a bridge between the US and some of these other revisionist powers to their advantage. And then sort of technology, so the idea of drones, smaller munitions, we see it in the combat with Ukraine and Russia. We're also seeing it with the Middle East and the South, the Red Sea and the Houthis. Being able to, so having smaller components, smaller missile systems, things that you can move around, that makes it harder to counter for the US. In the past, you would have had, fixed sites with missiles to launch, against shipping in the South China Sea. Now you have drones, you have smaller missiles, you have things that are more mobile, which are much harder even for highly technically advanced military like the US to completely squash. So that's enabling actors to, have a role in conflict, non-state actors and small state actors, in a way that 20 years ago they really didn't have very much. So
Yeah, one of the things that we've been reading about a lot lately are some of our enemies are using very inexpensive drones and other equipment to take up some of our very expensive missiles. Right, we're using very expensive armaments to take on, some stuff you could buy in a hobby shop.
yeah,
And Michael Kliegman, who is also a member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors, just put in the chat a great question on this topic. Uh, he he was saying he wanted to talk about onshoring. What about defense industries and supply chains on which they depend? And I think that's a great point too, right? That so many of our chips are made in China. Can we produce our high-end armaments without the cooperation of the Chinese? I think Michael's question is a great one. Do you have an opinion on this?
um, I think it's an issue. I know the folks, I'm only about a mile or so from the Pentagon, where our condo is. And so I know the folks over in that building, um, have recognized this and are definitely working on it. Um, there's a whole variety of different types of chips that are needed. And I think we're going to be okay, in the short term. Um, One of the big issues, of course, and it takes, I mean, these are to build a new plant, as you know, it's multi-billion-dollar investment, and it can take, multiple years to get it up and going. Um, we're probably going to have an overcapacity in about 5 or 8 years of chips because of all the new plants that are going to be coming online. But I think we'd rather have that problem than a scarcity issue. The big concern would be if China were to move forcefully against Taiwan, and the chip production in Taiwan going offline. I think that would be, not only our defense industry, but the global economy would be have issues with that in a major way, just because they play a big role in the supply, economy of so many countries. Chips now are a strategic good. Oil and gas, things that you need to run your economy, are things that would be considered a strategic good. And chips now, I think, are rightfully considered a strategic good. So it's an issue right now. China has restricted or said they were going to restrict some of the exports of rare earth metals. Again, there's opportunity, I think, for investors for both the mining, extraction, processing of these important components for chips, and things that go into the chips, because that's going to be crucial for our ability to have some independence in this area. But it's certainly an issue in the short term. It could be a critical issue if China were to move against Taiwan in the next 2 years. But it's something that the U.S. is working on. And I think again, over in 5 years, I think we're probably going to be in good shape. But it's that transition and that time in between that's concerning.
All right. So let's move on to some of the specific conflicts going on in the world right now. There are three major ones that are affecting supply chains and energy in particular. Why don't we start with Russia and Ukraine? What are your thoughts on that, and how tied up is that making the energy market?
Um, it's a good question. It's a conflict that's not going to end overnight, unfortunately. I see this being drawn out for a while. The Europeans have gotten engaged it'll be interesting to see, the resources that come in. The conflict in Ukraine is revitalizing defense industries to some extent because they're having to produce missiles, they're having to produce shells, they're having to produce munitions that, for the US and a lot of our partners haven't been a priority for a while. So I think, it is energizing the defense sector in the West and in the US to some extent. And that's not, the conflict's going to continue, and so that's going to be problematic. It's going to continue to, the Europeans and their diversification, that's going to be disruptive, and their reliance on liquefied natural gas, that's going to be, disrupting the liquefied natural, in distorting the liquefied natural gas market, until they can get pipelines built and new resources coming online. I think this is, another area where you're going to see elevated prices for a while. There's, again, a 5-10 year transition to getting new resources to be delivered to Europe. Oil and gas are fairly common. We just haven't looked in a lot of places or developed the resources because, gas and oil from Russia was cheap for the Europeans, so they didn't diversify. Now that they're having to go to other sources, this is, putting a lot of strain on their manufacturing industries, and even on their, household budgets. So I think, the higher energy prices are going to, be a drag for the European economy going forward for a while. There's going to be partnerships. There's going to be, opportunities for the development of, natural gas to be delivered to the Europeans, I think, to replace the Russian cutoff. And so, I think that's going to continue. The other sort of energy issue that's not necessarily conflict driven, but doesn't get a lot of attention is the whole AI and computing. And the demands for computer power, energy to power AI, that's going to really be a big impact. And I think that could strain, or the lack of affordable energy could constrain some economies as they are developing AI. So I think that's just another issue out there. But the conflict isn't going to end overnight. I think it's going to probably grind to sort of some sort of World War One-ish sort of battle lines where things are become fairly entrenched. There may be some movements, one way or the other over time, but it's not a good news story. There's going to be challenges for both Ukraine and Russia and even their economies as this conflict continues. So.
The one thing I've found interesting about all this, for all the predictions of economic doom from higher energy prices due to the conflict in Ukraine, we really haven't seen that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big industry in peddling doom and gloom. I think both for the newspapers, but also folks in kind of the political risk industry. You want to be able to shock clients so they can you can sign them up. I think it should be political risk and opportunity, because there are opportunities that come with this, with these challenges. And people are innovative. The Europeans were able to innovate. They were able to move faster with liquefied natural gas. Conservation helped a lot as well. So a lot of the doom and gloom in the world, thank goodness for market economies and capitalism and capital moving around, the world is able to adjust and adapt. Some of the grain issues with getting grain out, that's going to be a challenge. Some of the higher cost with the production of fertilizer and fertilizer that was coming from Russia and Ukraine. That was a challenge. Things went up, but the world's been able to accommodate. And I think innovation, new processes, conservation. These are things that help mitigate a lot of the doom. And sort of having been in Washington long enough and seen the world, watched the world for a long time, the folks who preach on the extremes, either doom and gloom or everything's bright and cheery and there's no problems. I think you can dismiss a lot of both those sides because of the reality and how things turn out is generally somewhere in the middle.
All right. Well, then let's move on to another troubling part of the world. China, potential conflict with both Taiwan and the Philippines. This obviously has huge impact on supply chains, in particular technology and chips. By the way, for what it's worth, I don't think an embargo of the NVIDIA high-end chips is going to work. These things are sold in the market. They can buy this stuff in the aftermarket or in other countries and move them. But the interesting thing there is they're telling us, Taiwan is ours. We're going to take it. We have more patience than you have staying power. The U.S. has implied that we'll defend Taiwan. It's not clear to me how exactly we're, with supply chains that long, we're going to potentially go to war in Taiwan. I think the potential conflict in the Philippines is a little bit easier. It's not clear to me what China's end goal is on that, but the U.S. does have a military presence there, and China has no historical claim to the Philippines. So, I'm guessing the Chinese will be a little more reticent to provoke the Philippines in the same way with the naval base there. But, what are your thoughts? Because this really does have a huge impact on supply chains and two of our allies.
Absolutely. I think the Taiwan issue, we may be looking at it a little bit wrong. It's interesting that the Chinese have gotten us to focus on sort of a direct assault on the island. I don't, militarily, there's challenges for them doing that. They're, just with geography and such. I see it playing out somewhat differently, and I'm not sure exactly how it would, but if they do decide that they're going to take Taiwan or reincorporate Taiwan, I think it would be, political warfare, creating a crisis, having an embargo. I know we're really focused on the military scenario and the direct assault, which we need to be. That's a precaution. We need to understand that, and the military, I know, is working the U.S. military and allies on how to potentially counter an actual sort of military assault invasion. But I think it's probably, if there is going to be an attempt to reincorporate the island, it's going to come off differently, and it's going to be a blockade. It's going to be something not as kinetically focused, at least at the start. And we need to think about how we can counter that. And I don't know that we've done enough from the U.S. perspective thinking about that. For supply chain and chips and things, it's, you could see traffic in the Straits of Malacca and through that whole area being disrupted in a crisis scenario. And that would, affect not only, China and, trading partners with China, but also Korea, South Korea and Japan potentially as well. And I don't, there is, so militarily, I think Taiwan is, it's something we have to plan. We have to have a contingency for. But again, I don't know that it's the most likely scenario, and I don't think it's something happening right away. They have their own economic challenges right now, demographic, potentially deflation, Xi's own sort of policies, the national securitization of economies, both in China, which was grow, 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 bring in foreigners. Growth is the biggest issue to stability and national security concerns being a priority, and growth being secondary, I think there. So and that's that's furthering the challenges and problems that the economy was already facing with their overproduction of infrastructure and housing. So I think Xi's making it worse. I think they're going to be hurting by foreigners leaving, foreign direct investment falling there. You have corruption issues in their military that make sort of have to pose challenges and questions to the leadership, how well their military would function, how well some of their defense systems would actually work. There's been anecdotal stories that come out about, instead of rocket fuel being used for rockets, it was used for heating and for cooking pots and such. So I think Xi has a lot on his hands within the country. It doesn't mean that he won't try to take Taiwan in the sort of near term, the next year to 5 years. But I think it's more towards the end of that spectrum rather than the next sort of year, 18 months. The Philippines, I think that's a bit more of a kind of issue for this year. The China's claiming basically all of the South China Sea is theirs. The Philippines have their territorial claims. They landed a ship on there's a sort of small shoal there called the Scarborough Shoal. And a number of years ago, they basically ran aground a ship onto that shoal and have kept sailors there continually to try to ensure that their claim to that territory and their territorial claims in the ocean are respected. And because it was a ship and it's made of metal, the seawater's eroding that. And most estimates I've seen have that if it doesn't get reinforced with other sort of materials, that the ship could go away this year. And China's been making it difficult to try to get the both resupply of the people there, but also then new building supplies for that shoal. So I think that's a potential hotspot that actually could lead to a limited military conflict with China as we have an allied relationship with the Philippines if they do actually get into a conflict. So that's the one area that I'm sort of concerned about with US-China military conflict right now. I think this year you're going to see, at least superficially, sort of a bit more warming of relations between the US and China, but the conflicts and the competition across the board are going to continue. And I think this makes it difficult for businesses in the tech industry, businesses that have a lot of revenue from China could get caught in this crossfire. The Biden administration is trying to erect some barriers. The efficacy of those is yet to be seen. They've also granted a lot of waivers. So while I think their policies make sense and are more strategic than past administrations in dealing with China, the implementation and how you actually keep this technology from China we have to wait to see how that, if that happens and how, But even raising the cost marginally for the Chinese, I think, is worth doing. That's my policy analyst hat. So, but I think, there's areas of tension, both with US and China and trade, competition for raw materials, competition for allies and partners in, the developing countries. That's gonna, those are sort of friction points. And then also economically, China has an overcapacity in the auto areas and in the solar and sort of green technologies. What happens if they try to dump that both in the US and in Europe? I think that's, you're going to see, you've already seen, so the US is threatening secondary sanctions for banks dealing with Russia. So a number of Chinese banks recently backed down and stopped some of their transactions with sanctioned Russian banks. The Europeans have decided to sanction a couple of companies in China and in India for supplying goods to Russia, which the Chinese aren't going to like that. They're not going to like some of the greater scrutiny on the trade deficit between Europe and China. And then you have the whole issue of electric vehicles and, the Chinese internal market isn't big enough for the demand. They're looking to export that. And so, what is that? I think that's going to lead to trade conflicts. And, individuals, possibly working in China could get caught in the crossfire. The Chinese and Russians have been known to use individuals as bargaining chips and to send a message. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's private sector companies and individuals. But I think those are going to be areas of conflict, again, between the US and China, and then also Europe and China, which are going to increase tensions and bad relations for quite a while.
Yeah, I think we should talk about supply chain issues a little more. I think from my point of view, I see two big issues. One is simply a lot of people are just viewing China as unreliable right now. And certain US executives, they don't want to be there for the exact reasons you were talking about, that they can be leveraged. Physically, they just don't want to be in China and in control of the CCP. And if you are physically in China, the CCP has control over you. But the other is one of the reasons we've had these lower prices for most goods for something like 40 years is because we've offshored so much, right? This whole globalization, which made sense when the world was relatively at peace. But at this point, given everything that we've seen on supply chains, I think companies are now leaning away from just-in-time, low-cost, fragile supply lines to, we're going to pay more, but it either needs to be produced domestically or, as you talked about, friendshoring in closer, more friendly locations. But doing that, having these safer, more robust supply lines, these shorter supply lines, less just in time, less emphasis on the cheapest source of product and more emphasis on the most reliable source of product, that's going to feed right into inflation.
Yep. Yeah, I think you and I both agree that inflation is going to be higher longer than the era of 0%, 2%. I think that's in the near term not going to happen. You're going to have increased costs across the board. It's going to be, the shipping costs are going to go down probably because it's closer in, but the other inputs, labor and just building these new factories, that's going to cost more, and you're going to have that, of course, is going to get passed on to the consumers. So that's going to be an area that both people running companies and investors are going to need to contend with, because that was kind of a golden age of globalization where the money kept going to places that could produce cheaper and cheaper, and we didn't think about the national security implications. And I really do think it's the U.S., the Europeans, the Chinese certainly are looking at trade policy, economics with the national security lens, and they probably should have been having a little bit more of this for the last 20 years. But we didn't see that. We didn't, we just let sort of business do business. And, I think for a while, people thought the end of history, we beat the Nazis, we beat communism. There was a McDonald's in Red Square, capitalism and democracy was flourishing, and it was just a one-way sort of course for history. And unfortunately, that hasn't proved to be the case. And there's real threats out there still, and we need to be smart about who we trade with and how we trade and what we the important critical industries for our national security and our well-being and our economic well-being. We need to really be sure we're focused on those.
So that's
going to be more costs.
That's Dr. David Glancy echoing Jerome Powell and deep knowledge investing with the higher for longer comment. I actually agree with you. We're not going back to zero rates anytime soon. We are short on time. I want to ask you one last question. You were talking about shipping a minute ago. Right now, the conflict that I think is causing the most shipping disruption in the world is between Israel and Hamas. And so, that the reaction to that by some of the Arab states around there have, talk about screwing up supply lines, right? They're trying to close some key shipping lanes, and in certain circumstances have succeeded enough to raise the price of shipping and the amount of time it takes to get goods from one place to another. So short on time, I know it's a complicated topic, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this. How does this get resolved? And what do countries that just want to get, shipping through the Red Sea lanes, what do they do now?
For the most part, they go through. There's going to be incidents. I think you're not going to get to it's kind of, I think, going to be an issue like crime. There's going to be, flare-ups and times where it's, right now and for the next, 6 months to a year, you're probably going to have a heightened level of attacks against ships. So, you can either, go around Africa. You can, the international community might be able to do some kind of convoy type to escort ships, but that's expensive for the militaries. The ships, you actually now have pirates taking advantage of the different routes that the ships are using when they miss or try to avoid the Red Sea. So you're having that issue come up, which is something I worked on at the State Department 15 years ago, and there's generally not an easy quick fix for these. The Middle East conflict, Israel and Palestinians, that's going to go on for quite a while. I think you're going to see the threats against shipping subside in the next, maybe 6 months to a year. But it's not going to be, sort of non-existent. There's going to be a persistent risk, but I don't think it's going to be that great. And I think you're going to see more ships kind of resuming that, but it's going to be 6 months a year out for that to happen.
All right. Terrific. So everyone, that was Dr. David Glancy of the Institute for World Politics with coverage of a wide variety of international issues. David, any last comments? And most importantly, how can people find you if they want to learn more?
Sure. The Institute of World Politics website, I think my email is on there. It's dglancy@iwp.edu. look forward to, you know, if folks have other questions or want to know more, you know, about the school. The school is a great institution that's training and educating new leaders in national security. We teach classes on political warfare and intelligence and statecraft, which I think to navigate this world on the policy side is, you know, really, really important. So
Yeah, and there's no question that the IWP has a differentiated point of view.
yeah,
There are lots of foreign policy schools, lots of schools to prepare people to work in government. I think they have a particular point of view. I think the IWP has a differentiated point of view. So, for people who are interested in traditional education with maybe a different point of view than you'd see at your local credentialed university, check out the IWP. I think it's worthwhile to understand the perspective that's being taught there. That seemed like a fair.
absolutely. Yes, no, and thank you so much for having the opportunity to address this, the audience, and to talk a little bit about these important issues.
All right. Well, terrific. Dr. David Glancy of the Institute for World Politics, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. For everyone watching this, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We know it's valuable. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.